The content in this video is compiled by us from many sources as well as contributions from the community. If there are any errors, please comment below. We will fix and change. What if everything you fear, everything you long for, and everything you instinctively avoid was written not in your childhood, but in the bones of your ancestors? We weren't born modern. We were born from silence, smoke, blood, and cold earth. Long before cities, before gods, before the word human meant anything civilized, there were people who survived without knowing they were surviving. We think of them as crude, barefoot, grunting, dragging their stories through the mud. But they had something we've lost, and in losing it, maybe we became more vulnerable, not less. The world didn't begin with words, it began with watching. After the storm came stillness. No thunder, no growl of predators, just the wet crackle of leaves underfoot and the thick scent of moss warmed by morning light. The tribe didn't speak. They listened because back then, silence wasn't emptiness. It was data. It told you whether your child was still breathing, whether the wind carried danger, whether the earth had shifted beneath the tracks. There was no language yet, not the kind we know, but there were eyes and fingers pointing, and that brief flash of the jaw that meant move, not later. Now, we often forget. Humans didn't rise because we were the strongest, but because we were the quietest, the most alert, the ones who paused when others charged. Our ancestors didn't run to fight. They waited, they crouched. And if the moment came, they didn't roar, they ambushed. That silence, that pre-verbal attention was not fear, it was mastery. There are cave paintings over 30,000 years old, buried in darkness, so complete you have to crawl on your belly for hours to see them. Why did they draw in secret? Why so far from the light? Because silence was sacred. What you didn't say mattered more than what you did. These weren't primitive minds. They were minds sharpened by the absence of noise. We like to think prehistoric humans were frantic, anxious creatures, always hungry, always cold, always running. But some of them sat still long enough to carve a line of ochre across a wall and leave it there for 1,000 generations. Stillness wasn't a luxury, it was survival. In a modern world drowning in alerts, silence feels like a failure. If you're not answering, posting, reacting, you're falling behind. But the truth is, humans are not built to operate at full volume. Our nervous system evolved to work in rhythms, surge then pause, effort then stillness. The pause is where you see. We've trained ourselves to think the brain is for solving problems, but for most of human history, it was for noticing. Where the dew bends the grass, where the birds stop singing, where the air changes without explanation, and in that noticing was the difference between life and extinction. The world was not silent, it was alive. A rustle meant rabbit or wolf, a crack meant shift or threat, and so the tribe listened, not just with ears but with skin, with breath. One misread silence and your child was gone. One ignored wind and the fire went out. Every sound had weight, every pause had purpose. There are records of some hunter-gatherer societies today who can name dozens of types of silence. Silence when the animal is near. Silence when someone's been hurt. Silence when the storm is coming. Silence after someone has died. We only have one word, and it shows. The silence after the kill was different than the silence before it, and it wasn't just external. It shaped how they grieved, how they taught, how they bonded. We underestimate how much was transmitted without words. The way one elder placed their hand on another's shoulder after a wound. The way a mother blinked once before sending her child away. Signals, not symbols. We think we've evolved past this. But why do you still flinch when someone looks at you too long? Why does a room full of silent people feel unbearable? Because you were not meant to ignore silence. You were meant to interpret it. Our attention span has shortened. But that's not because of smartphones. That's because we've disconnected from the type of attention our ancestors trained for thousands of years to master. Stillness is not inactivity, It's awareness without effort. It's readiness without tension. And in the stillness, something returns, the primal, the alertness that doesn't panic, the knowing that doesn't explain itself, the part of you that sees more when you're not trying to see anything at all. You are not far from them. You are built of their silences. Let's be honest. If you dropped most of us into the Paleolithic wild with no phone, no knife, no protein bar tucked under the waistband, we'd be dead in an hour. Two, if we're stubborn, but our ancestors, they made it work, not by rushing, not by brute force, but by listening. Listening wasn't a spiritual practice, it was engineering. A low, shifting breeze across dry leaves meant a boar was nearby. A silence in the birdsong, something worse. They didn't meditate to feel connected. They became connected because anything less meant getting eaten. The myth is that life back then was chaos, naked men with spears running at mammoths, women screaming over fires, but the real rhythm was slow, precision over panic. Even in the chaos, there was choreography. And within that silence, where we now might scroll or twitch, was a kind of focus we can't fake anymore. You didn't try to be present. You either were, or you got removed from the gene pool. This is where it gets strange. Neuroscience today is just beginning to understand how deeply our brains are wired for environmental attention, not social media, not verbal noise, but sensory awareness. Patterns of quiet observation activated more survival pathways than any shout ever could. So the ones who survived weren't just the strongest or smartest. They were the ones who paid attention to what wasn't being said. And they passed it on. You carry that. In the hairs that rise on your neck when a room goes quiet. In your instinct to pause before opening a door that feels wrong. That's not anxiety. That's ancestry. Even fire, yes, the grand leap, came not just from spark, but from silence. Someone had to notice the exact texture of wood, the way one bark peeled differently than another, the rhythm of breath and friction. Fire didn't come from force. It came from stillness and repetition. Sound familiar? It should. We're still doing it, just with touchscreens and algorithms instead of dry twigs. But here's the sad twist. We've begun to pathologize silence. Call it awkward. Label it dead air. We fear the pause, rush to fill it, drown it in updates and alerts. Yet evolution didn't prepare us for noise. It prepared us for nuance. Remember, they didn't have calendars, but they knew when the rains would come. They didn't have clocks, but they knew when the hunt should begin. Not because someone shouted go, but because the forest told them. The rustle shifted. The wind paused. The birds stopped lying, and someone listened. That someone is your bloodline. This isn't nostalgia, it's a fact of design. We are built not just for action, but for attention. Not just for noise, but for nuance. And when you sit still, really still, not with headphones or screens or podcasts about being present, but just present, you're not being lazy, you're remembering. You're reactivating a part of yourself that once kept entire generations alive. They didn't have Wi-Fi, but they were never disconnected. Maybe that's what we're missing, not information, not power, but the primal silence that let them see clearly. Because when you stop filling every second, the world speaks. And more importantly, you finally hear yourself again. The sun rose like it always did, without warning, without ceremony. Light filtered through low branches and caught in the ash of last night's fire. Smoke lingered, not because anyone stoked it, but because the coals still remembered warmth. In a nearby clearing, two figures bent over a rabbit carcass. One held the legs, the other peeled skin from sinew with a chipped flint. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The rhythm was older than language. Children laughed somewhere downstream. Their voices bounced off water as they tossed flat stones, splashing each other in patterns too specific to be random, but too chaotic to decode. One of them slipped and squealed. An older sibling helped them up, muttering something soft, maybe a warning, maybe a joke. Further uphill, a woman crouched beside a cracked pot. She ran her fingers along the rim as if asking it a question. Then she stood, walked 3 paces to the left, and began digging a shallow hole, not out of instinct, but out of knowledge. That patch of earth had clay, and clay meant more pots, more storage, more time. Nothing felt urgent, not even the man limping back into camp with a twisted ankle and 2 dead birds hanging from his belt. His injury would pass. The birds would feed someone. That was enough. If anyone had looked closely, though, they might have noticed the birds were thinner than usual, fewer feathers, less meat, or that the man's eyes lingered longer than they used to, scanning the horizon as if something familiar had shifted, just slightly, just enough to notice. But nobody looked closely, because why would they? Near the center of camp, a circle had formed, not by order but by habit. A grandmother sorted through a pile of roots, clicking her tongue as she tossed out the bitter ones. A teenager copied her movements without asking. Another worked nearby with sinew and shell, threading what looked like a necklace. Maybe it was decoration, maybe it was memory. The fire was rekindled, sparks jumped, and for a brief moment everyone paused not to watch but to notice. A child ran by with something in their mouth. No one stopped them. Somewhere in the woods, a bird cried out once, then silence. That morning didn't feel special. It didn't feel final. It felt like continuity. It felt like all the mornings before it. And that's the most haunting part. They didn't know it was the last one. No storm clouds on the edge of the sky. No strange animals fleeing the forest. No prophecy whispered by an old woman. Just another sunrise, just another task, just another fire. And then, nothing. Nobody woke up that day expecting history. That's not how history works. The youngest member of the group, a boy barely old enough to run without tripping, woke up first. Not because of instinct, but because something had poked him in the ribs, a stick maybe, or his sister's foot. He blinked at the light. The sky was soft and forgiving, like it had no idea what would happen later. He padded over to the fire circle, barefoot and half asleep, dragging a string of grass behind him. The embers glowed faintly. He poked them, got bored, and ran off. No one stopped him. No one thought, this will be the last time we see him do that. Nearby, 2 brothers argued, quietly, but with intensity. The older one insisted the trap line had been tampered with. The younger one thought it was just bad luck. Neither realized they were arguing over what would later be called resource depletion. But their tone held the weight of a planet slowly running out of favors. A woman ground seeds into flour, humming something ancient and tuneless. Her daughter sat nearby plucking feathers from a grouse. Feathers floated in the air like slow snow. At one point, the girl looked up and asked, "Do you think they'll come back today?" The mother didn't answer right away. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She said, "Keep plucking." Up in the trees, a scout watched the horizon, not because of any command, but because watching had become habit. He rubbed his chin. The wind came from the east, unusual for that time of year. His eyes scanned for movement, for smoke, for shapes. Nothing. That was what bothered him. Nothing is louder than nothing when you're expecting something. Back at camp, someone dropped a bundle of wood with a grunt. A woman nearby laughed. "You always think carrying more makes you look stronger." He smiled, pretending not to be flattered. Moments like this stitched the group together, insults that sounded like affection, tasks that blurred into conversation. They didn't know it, but they were doing something extraordinary, surviving while being human. That combination doesn't last forever. Mid-morning brought food, which meant stories. An elder pointed to the sky and began explaining why clouds moved the way they did, blaming birds, obviously. The others laughed, not because it was true, but because it was funny. Jokes were tools, humor was insulation against fear. That's why the silence that followed felt strange. Not wrong, just quiet enough for someone to notice. Someone said, "I haven't seen their smoke in 3 days." Someone else replied, "Maybe they're just hunting farther now." Then someone whispered, or maybe they're gone. No one answered that once. Because hope is stubborn, but doubt only needs one sentence to plan itself. By the time the sun stood directly above them, the camp was moving at full rhythm. Children gathering berries, men testing sling tension, women stirring bone broth. If you watched from above, it looked like balance. But cracks don't show from a distance. They start in conversations cut short, in glances that linger too long, in answers that come half a beat too late. The group wasn't falling apart, it was stretching, and soon it would snap, but not yet. Not that morning. That morning still belonged to routine, still belonged to warmth, movement, touch, friction, laughter. And so they stirred the pot, they counted the roots, they kept the fire going. And in doing so, they unknowingly lit the last normal day that place would ever know. Collapse never announces itself with a scream. It whispers, it nudges, and most dangerously, it makes itself look like just another Tuesday. The truth is, no single disaster brought them down. No firestorm swept the forest. No violent tribe marched in. What undid them was smaller, quieter, and far more human. Small decisions, made too late, layered one on top of the other like kindling beneath a still dormant flame. The first warning sign had nothing to do with war. It had to do with roots, specifically, the ones that used to grow along the southern creek. They'd stopped sprouting 2 seasons ago. No one panicked. The elders said it had happened before. But this time the rains didn't come back, and nobody wanted to say it, but everyone knew. The ground wasn't sick. It was done. Still, they stayed. People don't leave because things get bad. They leave when things get worse than bad. Until then, they rationalize, they adapt, they pretend. They tried foraging deeper into the woods. They started hunting smaller game. One man even suggested catching birds, then spent 3 days chasing shadows in the canopy, returning only with a bruised ego and 2 feathers. Everyone laughed. Laughter was cheaper than meat, but adaptation has limits, and when survival becomes too creative, it stops being sustainable and starts being desperate. They tried foraging deeper into the woods. They started hunting smaller game. One man even suggested catching birds, then spent 3 days chasing shadows in the canopy, returning only with a bruised ego and 2 feathers. Everyone laughed. Laughter was cheaper than meat, but adaptation has limits, and when survival becomes too creative, it stops being sustainable and starts being desperate. No one called it a crisis. They just got quieter. Meals got simpler. Bones were boiled a second time. Tools broke and were patched instead of replaced, and yet the camp looked the same. That's the thing about decline. It wears the face of normal until it doesn't. One night someone said, "Remember when we used to store extra?" Nobody answered. Tensions didn't erupt, they simmered. A few disagreements turned cold. A father and son stopped speaking after an argument about where to set traps. A woman who once nursed everyone's wounds now spent hours alone, staring at the hill. These weren't betrayals, they were cracks, and cracks don't shout, they just wait. The real problem wasn't hunger or drought, it was misalignment. A system that once thrived on balance between gatherers and hunters, children and elders, caution and boldness had tilted, and no one could quite say when it had started. Because it hadn't started, it had accumulated, like mold, like rust, like silence. This is where psychology comes in, not just of individuals, but of systems. Healthy communities respond to pressure by redistributing weight. Failing ones get rigid. People stick to roles that no longer serve them. Leaders insist they're not panicking. Followers pretend they believe it. The group moves forward toward a cliff they refuse to name. The irony, most of them were still doing their best. They hunted, they shared, they sang. Some still told stories. But under the surface, an unspoken truth had taken root. Survival was no longer a shared goal. It had become a personal calculation. Who gets the last root? Who knows how to make fire without a flint? Who gets blamed when it all falls apart? That was the seed, and it had already been sown. Let's talk about the human talent for denial. If you were to ask them, on that third moon after the creek dried, whether things were getting worse, most would have shrugged. We've had dry spells before, one would say, chewing bark for the second time that week. At least we're not the ones who disappeared, another might mutter, referring to the neighboring clan whose fire hadn't been seen in weeks, because it's always easier to believe the worst is happening to someone else. And when food is short, even hope becomes a rationed item. Here's where small systems theory kicks in. Communities, especially isolated ones, don't need catastrophe to collapse. They just need enough minor stressors to tip their social balance. A child cries longer than usual and no one responds. Someone suggests moving camp and silence answers him. Jokes get thinner, smiles cost more. Someone might have noticed the pattern, probably one of the older ones, but wisdom doesn't shout, it coughs. It sits near the fire and watches. It mumbles to itself, we used to listen more. They weren't lazy, they weren't stupid, they were tired. Decision fatigue isn't just a modern phenomenon. When every choice can mean life or death, eventually even the smartest among them just pick whatever doesn't get them yelled at that day. Power dynamics began to shift, subtly, then sharply. A man once respected for hunting now snapped when corrected. A woman who had memorized every plant in the valley found herself ignored when she warned that the river reeds were too bitter to eat. Old knowledge met new desperation, and desperation always wins the argument. And still no one named it, no one said collapse, not because they didn't know the word, but because saying it would have made it real. The brain evolved to favor stories that preserve the status quo. It's just a rough season, feels safer than everything we know is unraveling. This was not optimism, this was biology. At some point, the scavenging parties got smaller, less volunteers, fewer returns. Someone came back with a bite mark, not from an animal. No one asked questions. You don't ask what you already fear the answer to. Trust, the glue of any tribe, began to dry up faster than the roots. It wasn't dramatic, just quiet hesitations. A mother double-checking her child's food, a friend counting what he shared and what he kept. Little things that didn't used to matter now felt enormous. You might wonder why they didn't migrate, why they didn't seek the other clans, the other forests. And the answer is simple. They believed they were still the lucky ones. That belief is sticky. It holds fast even when your ribs start to show. Because to leave is to admit you might have waited too long. The first clue wasn't silence, it was absence. A single day without smoke from the northern ridge. Maybe they were hunting longer than usual, 2 days still possible. But by the third, someone noticed their fire pit hadn't been relit. It wasn't fear yet, it was confusion. Mild, uncomfortable, like waking up and finding your favorite tree missing. They had a system, primitive but precise. Every moon cycle, the neighboring group sent one person, always the same man, limping slightly from an old injury, with smoked roots and woven reeds. In return, they got fish, resin, and gossip. No one signed treaties, but mutual dependence doesn't need paperwork. He didn't come, not the next day, not the next week, and still no one said the word gone. Instead, they rationalized. Maybe he was sick, maybe their water source dried up, maybe they found better trade, maybe. When you live in a tight circle, the disappearance of another feels like the edge of your world just folded in. It wasn't that they loved him, but he was part of the scaffolding that made reality feel stable. If he was missing, what else might vanish next? One of the younger men suggested going north to check, just a simple walk, but nobody volunteered to go with him, not because they were afraid, at least that's what they claimed, but because they were busy. Repairing traps, drying moss. Rearranging the same tools for the third time that day. Fear often masquerades as practicality. Eventually, someone left a small pile of gifts at the old meeting place: dried meat, 2 beads, a flint shard, a peace offering, or maybe a test. If it disappeared, the strangers were still alive. If it remained, well, it remained. So they stopped visiting. The mind, when deprived of information, begins to invent. Were the strangers wiped out? Did they turn on each other? Did they leave for better land? Or were they simply watching, waiting, hidden among the trees with arrows drawn? Every scenario grew darker with each passing day. The tribe grew quieter. Even the children sensed it. Laughter softened into murmurs. Nighttime stories shortened. Eyes flicked toward the woods more often. Dreams became heavier. No one had seen a threat. But the imagination is a better horror artist than any predator, and paranoia doesn't need facts. It just needs silence. Some elders tried to explain it with omens. Their fire was too big, one muttered. They forgot to thank the river. Another whispered they took more than they gave. But even superstition struggled to comfort when every explanation boiled down to, they're gone and we're next. At the heart of it all was this: they didn't know whether the strangers were dead or simply done with them, which in some ways felt worse. It wasn't just the man's absence they noticed, it was the growing weight of unanswered expectations. The pile of trade goods they left sat untouched for days, eventually covered in a soft crust of dust and insect husks. Someone muttered that foxes must have taken interest, but everyone knew foxes didn't like salt-cured bark and flint. What they were really afraid of was that nothing had taken it, not even curiosity. Soon the absences bled into their routines. A child asked why the beads hadn't arrived. An old man cursed when he realized they'd run out of certain routes only the northern group had ever carried, and still no messenger came. Still no smoke, still no prints in the dirt. Instead of confronting this silence, they performed rituals of denial, planting new roots with exaggerated confidence, fixing old baskets with extra flair. One woman even made a dance out of weaving, as if rhythm could keep the unease from creeping up her spine. And then came the suggestion no one wanted to hear. We should prepare, someone said, low and slow, like a bad smell carried on the wind, in case they come back, but not as friends. It wasn't shouted, it didn't need to be. The words did their job, changed the air, hardened the ground beneath their feet. Soon, old bones were checked for sharp edges. Spears were inspected with new intensity. One man began sleeping closer to the path that led north. Just to feel the wind better, he claimed, but everyone knew it was so he could hear footsteps first. The scariest part wasn't the idea of violence, it was the uncertainty. If they were attacked, they could respond. But this ghosting by absence, this unrelationship, it was worse than war. It was silence without closure. And humans are terrible at silence. Their social world had collapsed by 1 degree, and in tightly knit systems, 1 degree is enough to start a slow-motion avalanche. Trust didn't break like glass, it unraveled like old rope, quietly. Strand by strand. Someone finally said it. They're not coming back, not angrily, not sadly, just like an observation, like the sun is down or there are no fish. And that one sentence did more damage than any roar of panic could have. Now the paranoia had shape. A group started suggesting watch rotations. Another person recommended moving camp altogether. We're too exposed, she said, eyes darting. What if they're watching us, waiting? Another asked, only half joking, if they should stop lighting fires at night. It spiraled, and what made it worse, no one could prove that any of it was irrational. That's the curse of the human mind. Give it a gap and it will fill it with stories, suspicions, shadows. And so, for the first time in many moons, the tribe that once hummed with laughter and gossip started whispering, not because they had secrets, but because they feared someone might still be listening. Fear has a strange metabolism. It doesn't need facts, just friction. and lately, friction was everywhere. You could feel it in the way people stirred their food longer than needed, in how they touched each other less. In the way conversations ended not with laughter, but with glances toward the tree line. The tribe had stopped speaking of the other group, not because they forgot, but because the words now tasted like ash. Silence became armor. And what wasn't said became more dangerous than any truth. In the absence of information, imagination stepped in. Some believed the other tribe had been taken by spirits. Others whispered of betrayal, that they had left not because of danger, but to become danger. The least creative theory, plague, was oddly the most comforting. At least death didn't strategize. The camp split into new factions, though no one admitted it. Some clung to order, reinforcing routines like a religion. Wake, gather. Sharpen, eat, repeat. Others became anxious architects of doom, redesigning camp positions, rerouting paths, obsessing over defensive angles no one had cared about before. Children noticed before the adults did. They always do. They stopped wandering as far. Their play grew quieter. One even asked his mother if the stars were angry. She told him no, but her voice cracked. One night a loud snap echoed from the forest, just a falling branch, but the fire froze mid-flicker. Every adult turned. No one moved. Then a man stood up, spear in hand, breathing hard through his nose. Another followed, then another. Nothing came, but something had changed. After that, everyone agreed to carry something sharp. Just in case became the shared prayer. They didn't need a god, they had fear. And fear is far more persuasive. It didn't help that one of them left. He didn't say goodbye. Just took his satchel and disappeared before dawn. Some said he went looking for answers. Others thought he went to warn the other group or to join them. No one followed, not because they didn't care, but because following meant choosing a truth. And nobody wanted to be responsible for that. In the days after, things frayed faster. Meals were shorter. Eyes darted more. A fight broke out over nothing, just someone taking more roots than usual. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it happened, that a brother's voice could rise like that. That hands could close into fists so quickly. Fear doesn't need blood to win, just the possibility of it. And maybe, just maybe, it was winning already. So they lit fewer fires, slept closer, spoke softer, pretended harder. No one said they were afraid, but you could hear it in the way they said everything else. Fear doesn't march, it seeps, it doesn't need a reason. Just a pause in conversation, a glance that lingers too long, a night where the fire is just a little too quiet. And lately, everything had begun to feel too quiet. They didn't say it aloud, of course. No one stood in the middle of the camp and shouted, "We're falling apart." That's not how unraveling happens. It starts with smaller things, a shared bowl passed less often, tools left unmaintained, fewer songs. Some claimed they still believed the neighboring tribe would return, that the silence was temporary, that nothing terrible had happened. But belief, like meat, spoils quickly without evidence. So instead, they made new rituals. Someone started sleeping closer to the weapons. Someone else sharpened spears twice a day. A third person began hanging bones on branches near the edges of the camp to listen for the wind, they said, but no one asked what they meant. Because everyone understood anyway. No new threats came, but the idea of threat didn't need an audience. It had already taken up residence in their muscles, their sleep, their dreams. One woman, usually calm, snapped at a boy who touched her water pouch. Another man began chewing bark until his lips bled. A third stopped speaking entirely. Each change, small enough to ignore on its own, added up to something heavier. One evening, someone suggested moving camp. No one answered. It wasn't the logistics they feared, it was the admission. Moving would mean saying, "This place is no longer safe." And no one wanted to be the one to say that, because if the place wasn't safe, maybe the people weren't either. The children were the ones who told the truth, not in words, but in how they avoided the outer trees. in how they mimicked their parents' new rituals. One boy even created a game. Pretending to stand watch with a stick, peering out beyond the clearing, others followed. It wasn't play anymore, it was rehearsal. And one day that boy vanished. They searched for hours, then days, no blood, no sign. Just his footprint at the edge of a stream, and then nothing. The mother didn't scream. She just sat down where they found it and didn't move for most of the day. After that, no one left alone. The decision didn't need to be spoken. It settled like mist over the camp. And while no one said he's gone, they also didn't say he'll be back. That's how fear wins, it removes the words. From then on, even dreams turned. One elder spoke of fire swallowing the sky. Another dreamt of silent shadows watching them from the ridge. A third simply refused to sleep at all. Just tired, he said, over and over. Everyone nodded. No one believed him. Trust once lost doesn't announce its absence. It simply stops showing up. And the tribe, this small, aching network of warmth and stories and shared bread, began to feel like a group of people practicing survival beside each other, not with each other. One woman left, not fled, not stormed off, just stood up one morning, packed some things, and walked out. When asked why, she said, "I don't know what's wrong here, but I know it's becoming part of me." No one argued. A few nodded, one even whispered, "Tell me if you find a place that still sings." Fear had spread, not as fire does all heat and ash, but as silence does, without drama, without climax. Just the slow, quiet undoing of what once held them together. No one declared it, no voice rose in alarm, but the silence thickened, and the rhythms of the camp changed in ways that only hindsight could translate. The meals shrank first. At the time, it felt like coincidence, smaller catches from hunting, roots that didn't stretch as far underground. They still ate together, but the circle grew tighter. Some simply sat with empty hands, eyes lowered. Children, once loud and unruly, became quiet watchers. Their play grew softer. They stopped asking questions, not because they had learned answers, but because they knew the adults no longer had them. One morning, a girl dropped a woven pouch. It split open, scattering bone needles across the dirt. No one scolded her. No one helped her pick them up either. She knelt, alone, brushing dirt from the bone tips. That moment stayed in the air longer than it should have. No one said, "We are afraid." But everything said it. There was still laughter sometimes. It came suddenly, too loud, like someone had remembered it by accident. It didn't spread. One person would laugh, then fall silent again, as if embarrassed by the sound. Joy had become a misplaced habit. The elders watched most of all. They said little. They'd seen what happened when speech filled the wrong silences. Their gazes had grown heavier, not with answers, but with memory, as if they recognized the slope before the rest had even seen the hill. One old woman began carving again, long, thin lines on soft wood, not symbols. She never explained what they meant. She simply left them beside the fire at night. In the morning, someone would move them. Not keep, not discard, just shift. A strange kind of ritual emerged. The marks changed nothing, but they gave the silence shape. The tension wasn't violence, it was absence. Not a clash of voices, but a growing inability to name the weight pressing on everyone's chest, like waking up mid-dream and pretending you weren't afraid of the dark. Even affection became rare. People still touched, but less, still hugged, but briefer. The warmth between them hadn't vanished, only retreated. Intimacy became something dangerous, a reminder of what could still be lost. One boy began talking in his sleep, not nonsense, real phrases. "They're still not coming. It's cold behind the trees. She left her shoes near the water." No one told him. They just watched him wake each morning, smiling like nothing had happened. The living carried the burden, the sleeping spoke it aloud. Sometimes someone would begin a sentence with, "Do you remember when?" but never finish. Memory was heavy now. Nostalgia, a kind of grief. and grief was the thing no one wanted to claim, because claiming it meant admitting something was over. Even the fire lost its brightness, not in color but in meaning. They still built it, still gathered, but the stories that used to pour from that glow, fewer, shorter, sometimes none at all. The fire had become less of a place to speak and more of a place to stay warm. They still moved through the day as if nothing had changed. Tools were mended, fish traps checked, ropes rebraided, but there was a slowness that hadn't been there before. Not from age, from weight, as if every hand carried something heavier than wood or hide. Conversations had narrowed to essentials. Past that, it's ready, watch your step. The longer threads, stories, jokes, predictions had been quietly dropped like fruit gone soft in the hand. There wasn't less to say, just more to avoid. Some tried to hold on. One man started singing again while twisting sinew into chord, a tune no one had heard in weeks. A child nearby perked up, almost smiled, then looked at her mother, who was staring past them, unmoving. The child turned away, the song stopped. The things no one said were loudest, like, she hasn't come back. Or he hasn't eaten today. Or even, if the others were alive, we'd have seen smoke. But no one said them. Because once the words left your mouth, you couldn't pretend anymore, and pretending was still keeping them afloat. One night, a young woman placed a small shell in the middle of the fire circle. A gift, she said. No one asked for what. She just smiled and walked away. In the morning, the shell was gone. No one mentioned it again. Ritual, once sacred, had become improvised. The older men, once the loudest, now became the stillest. They sat longer near the edge of the gathering, looking at the trees more than at each other. They weren't angry. They were remembering. They had seen other winters, other absences. And this one felt different. You could tell by the way they watched the sky, not as hunters tracking time, but as men trying to guess how long they still had. A woman stopped preparing herbs one afternoon. She just stared into the bowl in her lap until her fingers curled in. She didn't speak for a whole day. No one pressed. They brought her water. They sat near. That was enough. The tribe had no therapy, no diagnosis, but they understood collapse when they saw it. Love was still present, but not loud. One man tore cloth for another's blistered feet without asking. A mother hummed to herself even when her baby had long fallen asleep. A teen leaned against a friend while watching the fire, saying nothing. They were still trying, but trying had become quieter. Sometimes even the animals could sense it. Birds didn't come as close. Insects buzzed more boldly, unshoed. The forest felt like it had turned its ear away, waiting for something to end. A boy once pointed at the sun through the trees and whispered, "It's lining." Everyone heard him. No one corrected him, because something was lining. And they all felt it. They just didn't know what it would fall on. At night, they wrapped tighter, not for cold but for comfort. The space between bodies shrank as the space between words grew. Hands found hands. Eyes stayed open longer. They stared into the fire, willing it to say something they could not. They were still a tribe, but more like the shadow of one, and even shadows in time stretch thin. That evening began like any other. There were hands gathering wood, lips blowing embers back to life, eyes adjusting to the deepening dark. A child yawned, someone sneezed, a pot bubbled gently over flame. Nothing announced itself as final. They didn't know they were lighting the last fire. There was no speech, no ceremony, just the hush of familiarity, like muscle memory shaped from years of dusk. The circle formed, legs folded, the old sat first. Then the children curled against fur and knees. Someone passed food without words. The firelight painted stories on their skin, as it had for generations. A man began to speak, not loudly, not formally, just a tale, about the wolf who tricked the moon, about the tree that remembered when men were crows. The children leaned closer. The elders smiled. This was how they survived, not by hunting, not by tools, but by telling the world back to itself. Each story was a thread, and every evening they wove the tribe back together with it. But this night something loosened. One elder misremembered a line, another forgot the ending. A child asked what happened next, and no one had the answer. Laughter followed, but too quick, too sharp, like covering a spill. Still, they kept speaking, because stopping meant feeling the quiet, and the quiet had teeth. Someone offered a new tale, one no one had heard before. It was strange, dreamlike, a river that swallowed names, a star that blinked when someone died. The tribe listened carefully, as if the story itself might be trying to warn them. But no one said that out loud. Nearby, a woman who hadn't spoken in days hummed, softly. It was a lullaby, cracked with disuse but beautiful still. Others joined, not in harmony but in proximity, like standing beside someone rather than saving them. No one knew it was goodbye. That night the fire burned longer than usual. No one moved to put it out. Bodies slumped near the glow, eyes fluttering closed. A baby cooed, someone snored. The stars blinked as always. Trees swayed like they were listening. It wasn't dramatic. No wolves came, no storm, no scream, only the normal passing of time. A time they didn't know was about to leave them behind. What ended them wasn't loud. It was slow, gentle, unnamed. The fire crackled once more before sinking into ash. That, too, was part of the story, but there was no one left to tell it. The sky faded to charcoal before anyone noticed it had darkened. That's how the best evenings began, without ceremony, without preparation. The world simply dimmed, and they responded. One person placed dry bark at the pit's center. Another cupped their hands and breathed life into a coal. The fire caught like memory, suddenly there, as if it had never left. The children began settling before the logs were fully ablaze. There was no need to call them. The rhythm of flame pulled them like a tide. The old man who always began the stories scratched at his beard, waiting not to speak, but to feel when the moment was right. It came softly, as it always did. A small voice asked, "Can we hear the one about the fox with no tail?" He smiled, only if someone remembers the end. Laughter rustled the circle, but no one remembered the end. Still, they started the story anyway. They always did. The telling mattered more than the details. It was the ritual, the way fire wrapped around the sound of a voice, the way shadows leaned in as if they, too, were listening. Tonight, though, the rhythm felt off. Words stumbled, details drifted. Even the fire popped at the wrong times. One child asked why the fox lost its tail in the first place. The old man paused, blinked slowly, and said, "Because sometimes things fall off when no one is watching." That answer hung in the air longer than expected. No one corrected him. No one questioned the line. Instead, the silence after became the real story. A young woman, who usually only listened, spoke up. She didn't tell a tale. She recited a dream she'd had the night before, a tree splitting down the middle, full of crows whispering names. No one understood it. No one dismissed it either. In ancient tribes, stories and dreams were not separate categories. They were both information, just gathered from different realms. But this dream felt different, not prophetic, not poetic, just heavy. Someone shifted. Another cleared their throat. The air thickened. And then, as if to balance the tension, a boy no older than 6 began humming the tune from the previous night. Others joined him. It wasn't beautiful. It was imperfect, off-key, broken in places. But they hummed anyway, because humming gave the silence something to hold, because none of them had better words, because the truth was beginning to show at the edges, and no one knew how to name it. Eventually, the flames dimmed, not from lack of fuel, there was still plenty, but from disinterest. No one stood to feed it. No one moved to stir the logs. They just sat there, letting the fire shrink, letting the night do what it had always wanted to do. Return everything to darkness. A mother wrapped a blanket tighter around her child. An elder stared at the stars and didn't blink for a long time. Someone began to cry, not loudly, not dramatically, just the sound of breath catching and letting go. No one turned to look, because even grief had become a shared habit, like grinding grain or sharpening tools. Even this was part of the evening. There was no declaration of ending. No one said good night. No one said we're done. But something in the air said, this is the last time. Something in the stillness whispered, remember this shape because it won't return. The final sound was not speech. It was the pop of a coal collapsing into ash, and the darkness, ever patient, took back what it had lent them. The world didn't end with thunder. It ended with stillness. The first light broke as it always did, quiet and blue and slow. No omens, no ash in the air, just dew on the ground, clinging to leaves that hadn't heard the news. He was the last to wake. The boy, not quite a man, not quite a child, rubbed his eyes and reached for a name. No one answered. He sat up, blinked, scanned the space around him. The embers were dead. The ring of logs was empty. At first he assumed they had gone ahead, that someone had gone to fetch water, that the hunt had started early. He called again, softly, then louder. Still nothing. The trees held their breath. Even the birds waited. He stood and wandered. The sleeping spaces were untouched, as if people had risen and folded themselves into the wind. No sign of struggle, no blood, no tracks, just absence. And the echo of habits, that's what haunted him. The pot was still beside the coals, crusted with yesterday's meal. A basket leaned against a tree, half-woven. Someone's carving sat in progress, a figure with a missing arm. He touched it. It was warm from the night's memory, but fading fast. He didn't cry, not yet, not out of strength, but because his mind hadn't caught up to his body. He walked to the edge of the clearing and waited, because that's what people did when someone was late. He waited until the sun touched the top of the trees. He waited until hunger crept in. He waited until the shape of loneliness finally said its name. He screamed once. The sound startled even him. It tore out not as a word, but as a refusal, a desperate request to rewind, but the world didn't answer. It never does. He wandered farther than he should have, past the river, past the trail, into the tall grass where they never let him go alone, not because he wanted to find them, but because standing still felt more dangerous than disappearing. He wasn't looking for bodies. He was looking for explanation, but there was nothing, no claw marks, no burned trees, no broken branches, only the same forest, gently indifferent, the same wind brushing past without apology. And that's when the fear arrived, not like thunder, but like rot, slowly from the center out, the fear that he had missed something, that the silence wasn't accidental, that he had been left, or worse, that he was never meant to stay. He made his way back before dusk. The fire pit waited, as empty as before. He sat in the exact spot he'd slept, as if retracing would undo something. That night he tried to light the fire. It didn't catch. His hands were shaking too much. So he curled beside the cold stones and watched the sky blink open, star by star. And for the first time in his life, the dark didn't bring a story, just the sound of his own breath. And the terrible truth, he was still alive. And they were all gone. There was no warning, no smoke in the sky, no cries in the night, only the silence, an absence so complete it rang in the ears. He woke slowly, as he always did. The light filtering through the canopy struck the same angle as every other morning. For a moment he lay still, half caught in dream. The fire beside him had gone cold, nothing unusual, but the birds weren't singing. And when he turned his head, the space where his brother had slept was untouched, neatly arranged, undisturbed. No mat rolled up, no embers stirred, just the still impression of someone who hadn't moved in hours. He rose, confused but calm, brushing dry leaves from his shoulder. Maybe they were already at the stream. Maybe it was late. Maybe. He called out, a quiet name just once, no answer. He stepped past the fire circle. The cooking pot was still there, half filled with last night's broth. He stooped and touched it, cold, not freshly cold but deeply, like it had been left long before dawn. something in his chest began to stir, not panic, not yet, but a narrowing, as if his ribcage had forgotten how to expand. He walked through camp, slow at first, then faster. No one, no footprints in the damp soil, no discarded tools, no spilled water, not even the smell of smoke. The camp was clean, undisturbed, too clean. It was as if they'd packed up, except no one had. Where were the children? He moved to the sleeping area beneath the hollowed tree. Nothing. He looked up. The sun was rising. A breeze moved through the leaves like breath, but it wasn't theirs. He stood alone in the center of the world they had built, surrounded by all the objects of a life that had once included him. No birds, no fire, no footsteps. Only the question, "Why am I the only one awake?" he shouted now. Not a name, but a sound, a raw, cracking sound that bounced off the rocks and came back empty. He waited. Nothing answered, not even an echo. He climbed the ridge to the east, the one that overlooked the river path. From here he could see everything, the water glinting, the trees bending slightly, the stone pile where they had left offerings last spring, all as it should be. Except no one was moving. He dropped to his knees, staring. Still no fear, not the kind that makes you run. This was deeper, slower, the kind of fear that doesn't come from being hunted, but from being left behind, not abandoned. Forgotten, and then a memory, the story his grandmother used to tell, about the one who sleeps too late and wakes in a world no longer his. A boy who missed the call of the fire spirits, and when he rose, he walked through the bones of a people turned to dust. He had laughed at it then, now he couldn't. He walked for hours that day, searching, not shouting anymore, just walking, listening for anything that would prove he wasn't alone in the world. He found a necklace caught on a branch. He knew it. It had belonged to the girl who always sang during dusk. It was still warm from the sun, but not from skin. As evening came, he built the fire, not because he needed warmth, but because he couldn't face the dark without it. He sat beside the flame and waited, not for someone to return, but for the courage to believe they wouldn't. And in that long, burning silence, the world began to tilt. He was no longer part of a group. He was a witness. To what, he didn't know, but something had ended, and he was its memory. Centuries later, when the earth had sealed the silence under layers of time, someone dug it open again. It began, like many things do, with something that didn't make sense. A team of archaeologists, tired from 3 days of heat and monotony, brushed aside a thin crust of red earth. They expected nothing, fragments of pottery maybe. What they uncovered instead was an entire settlement, perfectly preserved. Intact and hauntingly empty, no burn marks, no mass graves, no signs of sudden disaster, just objects, dozens of them, still arranged as if someone had only stepped away. A stone bowl half filled with ash, a weaving frame mid-pattern. A child's toy made of bone and string, still upright. It wasn't what was found that disturbed the team. It was what wasn't. They had seen sites of conquest. They had seen plague burials. They had even documented what remained after volcanic ash drowned a village. But this was different. There was no death here, no explanation. Field notes from the excavation described it in clinical language. No indicators of trauma or migration. Absence of burial layers. Zero evidence of long-term abandonment before sealing. But unofficially, one researcher wrote in his journal, "It's like they left mid-sentence." They dubbed it the silent departure, and for years, the academic papers tried to force patterns onto the data. Was it drought? No water shortages in the sediment record. Was it conflict? No weapons, no barricades, no wounds. Was it disease? Then why leave the sick behind completely? Every hypothesis collapsed under its own weight. Nothing fit. Eventually, the focus shifted from asking what happened to asking, what does absence mean? An anthropologist from the University of Chicago coined the term archaeology of presence through loss, the study of what silence reveals. Because silence is not neutral, it has weight, shape, intention. In this site, they weren't witnessing extinction. They were witnessing a decision, one not captured in tools or fire, but in the act of erasure itself. What kind of society leaves no explanation? The answer, perhaps, lies not in what they feared, but in what they accepted. Some suggested a spiritual departure, a rite, a chosen vanishing, not suicide, but surrender. A belief that there was no longer anything worth clinging to in this world, and so they left, not in mass death, but in quiet dissolution. A philosopher visiting the site said, "What if this is not collapse, but completion?" In the years since its discovery, the site became sacred to some. Pilgrims came not to mourn, but to listen. They walked the pathways, touched the stones, and tried to feel the weight of lives lived and then let go. One visitor described it best. It's like walking through someone's memory just before they decided to forget. The site is now protected. No more digs, no more intrusions. Only recordings, silent scans, and maps of where things were before they weren't. And still, to this day, no one knows where they went, only that they did. When modern minds imagine the end of a people, they picture fire, war, collapse, a final scream etched into the stones, but most ends don't look like that. Most ends look like a pot never finished, a blanket left folded. A